From NFL glory to a fortune in freefall, imagine being one of the most feared players in NFL history. Earning millions, winning Super Bowls, becoming an MVP, and building a legacy so powerful that decades later, people still argue over who deserves to wear your number. Now imagine waking up years after retirement and realizing that the fortune everyone thought would last forever is reportedly only a fraction of what it once was. That is the shocking contrast surrounding Lawrence Taylor. And it is exactly why his story continues to spark debate across the football world. Stephen A. Smith has spent years making one thing perfectly clear. When it comes to Lawrence Taylor, he does not believe the legend should be casually compared to anyone. When a young Giants player wanted to wear Taylor's iconic "No, Whooshaloo," Smith reacted with disbelief, emphasizing that LT was not simply another great linebacker. He was the standard. 3 Defensive Player of the Year awards, an NFL MVP, 2 Super Bowl championships, and a reputation that changed the way offenses prepared for an opposing defender. But there is another side to that legendary career that is far less comfortable to discuss. According to widely circulated financial estimates, Taylor's wealth declined dramatically after his playing days. Some reports have placed his present net worth at around $200. Ling ling ling. Although celebrity net worth estimates are not official financial statements and can vary significantly, even with that important caveat, the contrast is staggering when compared with the millions Taylor reportedly earned through NFL contracts, endorsements, and business opportunities. So how can a player who once stood at the absolute peak of professional football end up facing such a dramatic financial reversal? The answer is not one mistake. It is a chain reaction involving business losses, tax problems, addiction, legal troubles, and years of difficult decisions. And the most important part of this story is that these events did not happen independently. One problem created pressure for another, and over time, the damage became harder to reverse. The football legend remained, the records remained, the Hall of Fame legacy remained, but the money was disappearing, piece by piece. And what happened next would reveal just how dangerous life after professional sports can become when fame, wealth, personal struggles, and financial decisions collide. Before we go deeper, tell me where you are watching from right now. If you believe NFL legends should have better financial protection and guidance after retirement, type 1 in the comments. If you think athletes are ultimately responsible for protecting their own wealth, type 2. And if you want more NFL stories like this, make sure you subscribe and stay with us, because the next chapter reveals where the financial collapse really began. Lawrence Taylor, the man who changed the NFL forever. Before anyone talked about Lawrence Taylor's money, his legal problems, or the years that followed his retirement, there was a much simpler story. A football player who seemed almost impossible to stop when Taylor entered the NFL. He did not merely become another talented linebacker. He changed what offenses believed they had to prepare for. Quarterbacks suddenly had to account for a defender who could wreck an entire game plan before it ever had a chance to develop. His speed, aggression, instincts, and relentless pursuit made him one of the defining forces of the 1980s NFL. Taylor spent 13 seasons with the New York Giants, and his resume became the foundation of one of the strongest defensive legacies in league history. He won Defensive Player of the Year 3 times, earned the 1,986 NFL MVP award, and helped the Giants capture 2 Super Bowl championships. His impact was so significant that his No. 56 became inseparable from his identity. For generations of football fans, saying LT was enough, there was no explanation required. That is why Stephen A. Smith has repeatedly spoken about Taylor with a level of reverence normally reserved for the most iconic athletes in American sports. Smith has argued that modern pass rushers can be compared to Taylor only with extreme caution because Taylor helped redefine the position itself. The conversation surrounding his legacy is not really about whether he was great. It is about where he belongs among the greatest players ever. But that enormous success created a dangerous illusion from the outside. Taylor appeared to have everything an athlete could want: fame, championships, recognition, money, endorsements, a career that would eventually place him in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. The assumption was simple. Someone who reached that level would never have to worry about money again. But professional sports history is filled with examples proving that earning millions and keeping millions are two completely different skills. Taylor's career happened during a different financial era than today's NFL. Player salaries were far smaller than the massive contracts modern stars routinely receive. And financial planning after retirement was not always treated with the same importance it is today. For Taylor, the challenge became even more complicated because the pressures surrounding his personal life were developing while his football career was still at its peak. The same intensity that made him terrifying between the lines did not automatically disappear when the game ended. If anything, the years after football exposed weaknesses that athletic greatness could not protect him from. And eventually, the first major financial warning signs appeared. Taylor tried to transform his fame into a business empire, believing that his name could continue producing wealth long after his playing career was finished. That decision looked like the beginning of a second career. Instead, it became one of the first major cracks in the financial foundation he had spent years building. The million-dollar business that suddenly collapsed. Retirement is supposed to be the moment when an NFL star finally gets to enjoy everything he worked for. For Lawrence Taylor, however, retirement became the beginning of another battle. He understood that football would not pay him forever. So he attempted to build something beyond the field. His name was already valuable. His reputation was enormous. And the natural assumption was that the business world would recognize the same opportunity. Taylor became involved with All Pro Products, a company intended to turn his celebrity and business ambitions into a long-term source of income. On paper, the concept made sense. An NFL legend attaches his name to a company, builds a brand around that recognition, and creates a financial engine that can continue operating after the stadium lights disappear. But the plan did not end the way Taylor hoped. Reports about the company's value have varied dramatically, with some accounts placing Taylor's stake at millions of dollars and others describing much larger figures. What is far more consistent across accounts is that the venture ultimately suffered severe financial problems, and Taylor experienced substantial losses. The painful part was not simply that a business failed. Taylor reportedly believed he could trust the people helping him manage the operation. Instead, allegations of fraud involving business associates became part of the story. The lesson was brutal. Fame can open the door to business opportunities, but fame does not automatically teach someone how to recognize who deserves access to their money. And once millions begin moving through companies, contracts, partnerships, and investments, mistakes can become enormously expensive. Then came another financial problem: taxes. Taylor pleaded guilty in the 1990s to filing a false tax return connected to an earlier tax year. The consequences were not limited to one payment. Tax problems can trigger penalties, professional fees, legal expenses, and years of financial complications. For someone already dealing with business losses, another major obligation could become overwhelming. This is where the story begins to look less like one unlucky investment and more like a financial chain reaction. Money was leaving through business losses. Legal problems were creating additional expenses. Tax issues were adding another burden. And at the same time, Taylor was dealing with personal struggles that would become even more damaging. By the late 1990s, the financial pressure had become impossible to ignore. Taylor filed for personal bankruptcy, with reporting placing the filing around 1,998. Court records and contemporary accounts described a man struggling to keep up with financial obligations, including mortgage payment. The image was almost impossible to reconcile with the player fans remembered. This was Lawrence Taylor. The man who once made quarterbacks panic was now fighting a completely different opponent. Debt and bankruptcy would not be the final warning. More than a decade later, another filing would demonstrate that the underlying problems had never been completely resolved. The hidden addiction behind the financial disaster. The most difficult part of Lawrence Taylor's financial story cannot be understood by looking at bank accounts alone. Behind the business losses and legal problems was a personal struggle that Taylor himself has discussed publicly over the years. Addiction. According to Taylor's own accounts, his drug use began during his NFL career. That detail changes the entire timeline because it means the problem was developing while he was still producing some of the most dominant performances the league had ever seen. On Sundays, fans saw a superstar. Teammates saw a relentless competitor. Opposing quarterbacks saw a nightmare coming off the edge. Away from the field, Taylor was dealing with something entirely different. In later interviews and autobiographical accounts, Taylor described periods when his spending on drugs and other personal activities reached extraordinary levels. Reports have cited thousands of dollars being spent in a single day during the worst periods. Whether every reported figure can be independently verified is difficult to establish. But Taylor himself has been unusually open about how destructive the addiction became. The financial consequences were obvious. Every dollar spent was money that could not be invested, saved, or protected for the future. But the deeper damage was not simply the cost of the substances. Addiction can affect judgment, relationships, professional opportunities, and the ability to make rational decisions under pressure. Taylor's struggles eventually became public. In 1988, he was suspended by the NFL after testing positive for cocaine. The suspension was a warning that his private problems were becoming impossible to keep separate from his professional life, but even that did not immediately end the cycle. After retiring from football in 1993, Taylor entered rehabilitation more than once. The timing is important because his financial problems were escalating during roughly the same period. Business difficulties, tax trouble, bankruptcy, and addiction were no longer separate stories. They were connected. When a person is fighting addiction, the consequences can extend far beyond the immediate cost of the habit. Legal expenses can increase, careers can suffer, endorsement opportunities can disappear, trust can break down, business judgment can become compromised, and once income decreases while expenses continue, wealth can disappear faster than anyone expects. Taylor eventually achieved significant periods of sobriety, showing that recovery was possible. But stopping the behavior did not erase the financial damage that had already occurred. The business losses remained. The tax problems remain. The legal expenses remain. The bankruptcies remain. Getting clean could stop the bleeding, but it could not turn back the clock. And then came another problem. Even after Taylor appeared to be rebuilding his life, the consequences of his past continued to follow him. Bankruptcy. When an NFL legend couldn't save his own home, the word bankruptcy sounds almost impossible when attached to Lawrence Taylor. This was a man who had earned millions playing professional football. A player whose name had become synonymous with dominance. Someone who had experienced the financial rewards that came with being one of the NFL's biggest stars. Yet his financial history eventually reached a point where bankruptcy became part of the public record. Taylor's first major personal bankruptcy filing came in the late 1990s, around the same period when he was dealing with rehabilitation and serious financial complications. Reports described difficulties involving mortgage payments and other debts. The contrast was devastating. An athlete who had once commanded enormous income was struggling to protect basic personal assets. But perhaps the most important lesson was that the bankruptcy did not magically solve everything. A decade later, Taylor faced another serious financial crisis. In 2009, reports said he filed for bankruptcy again, in an effort to prevent foreclosure on his home. Two bankruptcy proceedings separated by roughly 10 years reveal something more important than either filing individually. The financial problems had not simply been one bad year. They had become a recurring pattern. That distinction matters because many retired athletes experience temporary financial setbacks. A bad investment happens. A business closes. A lawsuit arrives. A player loses a major contract. With proper planning, those situations can sometimes be recovered from. Taylor's situation was different because multiple pressures were appearing at the same time. His business had suffered. Tax issues had created additional obligations. Addiction had consumed money and affected judgment. Legal problems generated expenses. And his post-football income could never realistically match the earning power of his playing career. Once the NFL checks stopped arriving, the reality became much harsher. The millions earned during the playing years were not an endless supply. Every expense mattered. Every bad decision became more expensive. Every lost opportunity became more difficult to replace. That is one of the most overlooked dangers facing professional athletes. The public sees the contract. They do not always see the taxes, agents, attorneys, business expenses, family obligations, investments, insurance, debt, or lifestyle costs behind it. Taylor's story demonstrates that wealth is not determined by how much money enters an account. It is determined by how much remains after years of decisions. And while his second bankruptcy exposed the financial consequences, another part of Taylor's life was creating a completely different kind of pressure. The money was already disappearing. Now the legal battles were about to become a permanent part of his public identity. The legal battles that kept draining his fortune. By the time Lawrence Taylor entered the 2000s, it looked as though he might finally be rebuilding. He had survived the worst years of his addiction. He was appearing in media projects. He explored acting. He participated in Dancing with the Stars. He even took on voice work connected to the Grand Theft Auto franchise. For a while, the story seemed to be changing. The former NFL superstar was no longer defined only by his past problems. He appeared to be creating a second chapter. Then came another major legal crisis. In 2010, Taylor was arrested in New York in a case involving a 16-year-old girl. The initial allegations were serious, but the case ultimately ended with Taylor pleading guilty to misdemeanor charges related to sexual misconduct and patronizing a prostitute for illegal sexual activity. He received probation, affine, and registration as a sex offender under New York law. The case changed the conversation around Taylor permanently. This was no longer just a story about money disappearing. It was about reputation, legal consequences, and a public identity that could not simply be repaired with another television appearance. Taylor later faced additional legal trouble connected to requirements associated with his registration status. His attorney has argued in such cases that Taylor did not knowingly commit an offense and that misunderstandings surrounding address reporting were involved. Regardless of the legal arguments, each new court matter brought more attention, more professional expenses, and more pressure. And this is where financial collapse becomes complicated. Legal trouble does not have to directly take millions from a bank account to create financial damage. Lawyers cost money. Court proceedings cost time. Travel costs money. Lost opportunities can become expensive. Public controversy can make companies less willing to work with someone. For an athlete whose earning power once depended heavily on fame and endorsements, reputation is itself an economic asset. When that asset becomes damaged, income can disappear, even if no court directly orders someone to surrender it. That is why Taylor's story cannot be reduced to the claim that he simply spent all his money. The reality is more complicated. Money was lost through business problems. Financial obligations accumulated. Addiction created additional spending and instability. Legal cases created more expenses. Meanwhile, the enormous NFL income that once made recovery easier was no longer available. Every problem became connected to the next. And yet, through all of this, something extraordinary remained untouched. The football legacy. No bankruptcy could erase the MVP. No court case could remove the Super Bowl rings. No financial estimate could change what Taylor had accomplished on the field. That contradiction is what makes his story so fascinating. One version of Lawrence Taylor remains immortal. The other has spent decades trying to recover from the consequences of life after football, the comeback that almost changed everything. There was a point when Lawrence Taylor's story could have ended very differently. After years of addiction, financial turmoil, and public controversy, Taylor managed to rebuild parts of his professional life. He appeared on television. He took acting opportunities. He became recognizable to a new generation that knew him not only as the Giants legend but also as a media personality. That period matters because it proves something important. Taylor was not simply a man who lost everything and disappeared. He kept finding ways back. His football reputation gave him opportunities that most people could never access. Even decades after retirement, the name Lawrence Taylor still had enormous value. Fans wanted to hear him speak. Networks wanted his perspective. Producers wanted the recognizable Hall of Famer. His presence still carried weight. For someone trying to recover financially, that visibility could have become the foundation of a new beginning. But rebuilding wealth after a major financial collapse is different from rebuilding a career. The income may return, but the old fortune does not automatically come back with it. The contracts are smaller. The endorsements are different. The expenses accumulated during years of instability do not disappear, and time itself becomes an enemy. An athlete who earned millions at 25 cannot simply recreate those earning years at 50 or 60. Taylor's comeback therefore became a race against history. He had to rebuild his reputation while living with the consequences of decisions made decades earlier. And then another reality became impossible to ignore. Financial recovery requires consistency. A few successful television appearances cannot replace 13 years of NFL income. A speaking engagement cannot recreate a championship-era contract. A celebrity appearance cannot undo bankruptcy. The only way forward is sustained financial discipline. That is where Taylor's story becomes a lesson far bigger than one former player. Professional athletes often receive extraordinary amounts of money at an unusually young age. They are expected to understand investments, taxes, contracts, business partnerships, and long-term planning while simultaneously dealing with fame and pressure that most people will never experience. Talent creates income. It does not automatically create financial literacy. Taylor's comeback showed that a person can survive devastating setbacks and still rebuild pieces of a life. But it also showed that recovery has limits when decades of financial damage have already accumulated, and as Taylor moved deeper into retirement, the question became less about whether he could become the football icon again. That part was already guaranteed. The real question was whether the man behind the legend could finally escape the consequences of his past. When Lawrence Taylor's greatest legacy met his darkest years, there is a strange contradiction at the center of Lawrence Taylor's life. Ask football fans about him, and the answers are almost universally about greatness. They remember the explosiveness, the sacks, the intimidation, the championships, the MVP season, the way he forced offensive coordinators to redesign game plans simply because he was standing on the other side of the line. Ask about his life away from football. However, and an entirely different collection of words appears. Addiction, bankruptcy, business losses, tax problems, legal battles, and controversy. Both stories belong to the same person. That is what makes Taylor's legacy so complicated. Stephen A. Smith's passionate defense of Taylor's football greatness reflects why the player remains so revered. Smith can argue that no modern defender should casually claim the same status as LT because the original changed the game itself. And he has a point. Whatever happened away from the field, Taylor's football accomplishments cannot simply be erased. His legacy belongs to NFL history. But greatness on Sunday does not guarantee wisdom on Monday. That may be the most important lesson hidden inside this entire story. Taylor once described a connection between the reckless intensity he displayed on the field and the way he lived away from it. In retrospect, that observation feels almost prophetic. The same fearless personality that helped make him an extraordinary competitor could also make certain decisions more dangerous when there were no coaches, teammates, or defensive schemes controlling the consequences. Football has rules. Life does not always provide the same boundaries. On the field, Taylor could attack a problem with speed and aggression. If the play failed, there was another snap, another drive, another game. Financial decisions do not work that way. A bad investment can take years to recover from. A tax problem can follow someone for decades. Addiction can destroy relationships and judgment long before the financial consequences become visible. A legal case can permanently alter a reputation. There is no fourth quarter in real life. No scoreboard resets. No guaranteed next season. That is why the story of Lawrence Taylor should not simply be framed as an NFL legend who lost his money. That description is too simple. It is the story of an extraordinary athlete whose greatest strengths did not always translate into the world beyond football. His records remain. His championships remain. His place in NFL history remains. But his financial story became a reminder that even the most powerful reputation in sports cannot protect someone from the consequences of repeated personal, financial, and legal decisions. And when the numbers are finally placed side by side, the scale of that transformation becomes almost impossible to ignore. $50 million gone. Where did all the money go? So now we reach the question that has driven this entire story. How does a player who reportedly earned tens of millions of dollars end up with financial estimates that are sometimes placed in the low six figures? The first answer is that there is no single verified number that tells the entire story. Celebrity net worth websites are estimates, not audited financial statements. Different outlets use different methods. And some figures connected to Taylor's wealth have varied substantially over the years. So the often repeated $200,000 estimate should be treated as an estimate, not an official statement of his personal balance sheet. But even with that caution, the larger financial story remains striking. The money did not disappear in one dramatic moment. It was reduced over time. Business losses took a portion. Reported fraud involving associates created another blow. Tax problems brought additional obligations. Addiction consumed enormous resources and affected decision-making. Legal battles created years of expenses. Bankruptcy disrupted his ability to preserve assets. And the income available after retirement was nowhere near what he could earn during his NFL prime. That is the real financial lesson. People often imagine an athlete losing a fortune through one reckless purchase, one bad investment, or one enormous spending spree. Taylor's story illustrates something much more dangerous. The slow leak. A little money lost here, a legal bill there, a business setback, another financial obligation, another period of instability, another lost opportunity. Individually, each event might not destroy a multi-million-dollar fortune, but when they continue for years, the cumulative damage can become enormous. And once wealth falls below a certain level, rebuilding becomes increasingly difficult. Imagine earning millions in your 20s and 30s, then trying to recreate that wealth decades later when your primary career is already over. The mathematics become unforgiving. That is why the headline number is less important than the pattern behind it. Lawrence Taylor did not lose his football greatness. He lost the financial protection that people assumed would automatically come with it. And perhaps that is why his story continues to resonate with NFL fans. Because every year, another young player signs a massive contract. Another rookie receives his first major paycheck. Another superstar becomes one of the highest paid athletes in the country. The natural assumption is that these players are set for life. But a contract is not a guarantee of lifelong security. Money has to be protected. Decisions have consequences. Trust has to be earned. Professional advice has to be taken seriously. And the discipline required to preserve wealth can be just as important as the talent required to earn it. Lawrence Taylor remains one of the greatest defenders the NFL has ever seen, but his financial journey is a warning that even an immortal sports legacy cannot guarantee financial security. The jersey can be retired. The records can remain forever. But money can disappear one decision at a time. Takeoff's legacy? What will he be remembered for? After years of legal disputes, family tensions, and questions surrounding millions of dollars in assets, Takeoff's story still has no simple ending. But the biggest question may not be who controls his money. It is who will protect the legacy he built during his short life. Takeoff was more than one-third of Migos. Alongside Quavo and Offset, he helped create a sound that changed modern hip-hop and turned Migos into one of Atlanta's most influential rap groups. His death on November 1, 2022, at just 28 years old, left behind not only grieving family members and millions of fans, but also music, royalties, publishing rights, and an estate that would become the center of legal disputes. Titania Davenport, Takeoff's mother, became one of the key figures connected to his estate. At the same time, disagreements involving other family members raised difficult questions about inheritance, control, and who should have the final say over Takeoff's remaining assets. And that is what makes this story so complicated. Money can be divided, assets can be transferred, legal battles can eventually end, but Takeoff's music cannot simply be divided between competing sides. His verses are still being played. His voice is still heard. His work with Migos continues to influence hip-hop. While fans around the world continue to remember the artist behind the music, Takeoff was often the quietest member of Migos. But his style was unmistakable. His calm delivery and precise flow became an important part of the group's identity. Today, the legal questions surrounding his estate may still demand answers. But for fans, another question matters just as much. Will Takeoff ultimately be remembered for the millions he left behind? Or for the music and legacy he created? Perhaps the answer is already clear. Because even though Takeoff is no longer here to tell his story, every time his music plays, his voice continues to speak for him. Takeoff may be gone, but his legacy is still alive.